This happened when I was around 20 years old. This was way before cell phones and navigation garments. I was working off the books for a media company at the time, who were paying me for my photography and videography skills. I had all the top quality video equipment for the time, which held to today's standards would be like comparing an Nokia to an iPhone. I was being paid to go out into the wilderness and record hours worth of background footage of lakes, trees, etc. They would use this as stock footage for various documentaries and such. I drove about half an hour to find a good place in rural Maryland to do the shoot. Then I parked my car in a dirt road and hiked for a while, finding a few good shooting locations. It was good for me to get sunset and nighttime shots as well, as different times of day created different lighting for the videos. When I figured I had enough, I started packing up my copious amounts of equipment and threw my 2 bags over my shoulders and began walking. And walking. I started to realize I should have reached the dirt road where my car was by now. There came a time when I had to accept it. I was lost. I had absolutely no way of knowing which way was which. I'd done wilderness shoots before, and never had I run into that problem before, but usually I'd have a compass with me. Not this time. I kept walking for so long, it got to the point that I was letting out little cries to myself in stress, wanting nothing more than to just find my car and go home, feeling absolutely helpless. Eventually, after many hours, I came across a small building. It was an old house that appeared to be abandoned in the middle of the woods, indicated by the vines crawling up the sides of the home, plus the broken glass. Continuing to walk around in the woods in the night was the last thing I wanted to do, and seeking refuge for the night made more sense. I walked up the wooden stairs to the front door, which seemed to have already been broken in. All I had to do was push it with a bit of force, and I was inside. It was next to pitch black in there, and every step I took I felt like I was stepping on rubble or trash. I did, however, manage to find the bedroom of the house, which still had a bed in it, mind you, probably a filthy bed at that, but it beat sleeping in the woods or hiking around any longer in the dark. I shut the door and plopped my stuff on the floor and arranged one of my bags to act as a cushion between me and the actual bed itself. Then I tried my best to fall asleep in this dark, abandoned, foreign location in the middle of the woods. It was surreal, and it was scary. The window in the room was broken so I could hear the wind and bugs outside, but over that, there was the slightest, and I mean slightest little creep from a few feet away from the bed across this tiny bedroom. I looked up, and even though it was dark, I could vaguely see a closet door in the corner. It was moving. It had to be the drift. It had to be. I was letting my paranoia get the better of me in this freakish situation, but then, over the sound of the bugs and wind, I heard something from inside the room now. It was a gurgling type sound, like a throat noise. I looked at the closet again. Something was coming out from the darkness of the closet. I got up to grab my stuff off the ground. Within arm's reach now, I was staring at someone else in this room in this abandoned house in the middle of the forest. Here's my description of what I saw: a man wearing a woman's wig with some kind of makeup on his face. As for what he was wearing, I didn't really notice that, but I think it was something dark since I couldn't really see it. I grabbed my bags and started saying I'm sorry as I ran out of the house. I didn't know if this was their house or not at the time, but either way, I didn't want any trouble. As I ran away from the house, I heard footsteps tailing behind me at first. I think this is when the adrenaline really kicked in, and I suddenly had this insane amount of energy to keep running until I felt I had escaped. And even after that, I kept running, hopping over logs and rocks and twigs, trying to find a road, any road, with the logic that there's only so much forest left in the state, I'd have to run into a road eventually. And finally, I did. I walked down the road, and within 10 minutes a car passed, and I hitchhiked my way back to my truck. On my way home, I had time to reflect. That house was absolutely abandoned. The door and all the windows were smashed open. There was trash all over the place. I can't use logic to explain it because it's not explainable. I am grateful I was unharmed, though. When I was 19, I worked as a camp counselor at a summer camp. The job would be to entertain and chaperone a large group of kids with a bunch of other counselors for 3 sessions for the summer. That meant 3 different groups of kids would come at different points in the summer. Each group would come for 2 weeks, which meant I was away from home for this job for a total of 6 weeks. By the time the last group came, summer was more than half over, and I was ready to finish this job and get home. At some point during the second week of the 3rd session, and the final week of the kids in my group named Todd wasn't feeling good, so he wanted to go back to the cabin to go to sleep while everyone else was around the campfire. When we got back to the cabin for 10, 12-year-old boys, I left Todd to brush up and go to bed. Upon exiting the cabin, a little girl, probably 8 years old, was waiting in front. She wasn't supposed to be in this section, especially not alone at this hour at her age. I asked her where her group was. She didn't answer me. I asked her what her name was. She said Willa. I asked her what her counselors' names were. She didn't answer. I took her hand and brought her into the front section of the cabin. Then I told her to wait there. I started to run across the camp to the other activity sections, hoping to find the girls' group. When I couldn't find them, I ran straight for the section with the girl cabins. I found one of the female counselors with a small group of 7 to 8-year-old girl campers and asked her if she had any girls named Willa in their group. The counselor was certain there was no one with that name in any of the girls' groups, actually. Next thing I did was run back to the boys' cabin where I left the girl with plans of bringing her to the front office building. I got back to the cabin, however, she wasn't there. I went towards the back section by the beds and asked Todd if he'd seen a girl walk in there, to which he looked confused and said no. So now in a panic, I ran outside and looked in the immediate area of the cabin for the girl, when suddenly I screamed, "Come from the woods." I was beyond shook. I can't even come up with better words to use for how I was feeling when I heard that scream. I wanted to run for help, but I felt like whatever danger she could be in could be time sensitive, so I ran into the woods calling Willa's name. It didn't return any calls back for a while, and I felt like I was hopelessly running into the dark woods. Until finally, after some time and calling the name Willa constantly, there was a scream echoing through the woods, very close this time. I continued a bit further, and there she was. That little girl named Willa. She was standing straight in front of a tree, looking at me, as if she were waiting. I told her to come to me in a quiet voice as I slowly approached her. But then she turned and started running. I didn't know why she was running, but I had to follow her. She was surprisingly fast, but I kept up. I saw her slow down and stop ahead, though my vision of her was intruded by a few trees, as it was the whole time I was chasing her. I stopped and hid behind a tree, thinking maybe I could sneak up on her and grab her if I was quiet enough. And I noticed something in the near distance. It was some small, dim red light waving around behind some foliage. The girl then ran over to the light and apparently ducked down out of sight. I was trying to put the pieces together just as I saw some larger figure emerge from where the girl had just disappeared to. And this figure was crouch walking in my direction. I was able to put 2 and 2 together and assume this was some kind of trap. So I turned and sprinted all the way back to the campgrounds and ran straight for the main office. I spoke with the camp coordinator, Jackie, told her about the suspicious activity that just took place, and advised that all camp activity should be cut short for the night. Any incident like this would be treated very seriously for the safety of the children and the well-being of the camp's reputation. Authorities had been alerted about suspicious activity on the campground. They came, I helped them with their report, and they left. By morning, everything was back to normal. The season was over before we knew it, and that was that. I have my own theories of what I witnessed in the woods that night. The most logical has to be the possibility that a man was using that little girl, maybe his daughter, as some kind of bait to lure unsuspecting victims into the woods. And what would happen next? I have no idea. I'm glad I didn't find out. A couple of years ago, I moved out of my dorm room and into a new apartment. Of the few pieces of furniture that we had in the dorm, none of it was mine, so I was basically in need of everything. I had more money than I did before and was planning to save for a few more months before making a bunch of purchases on things for the apartment. There were still a few things I did need right away, though. One of these was a bed frame, but they were all really expensive. After buying a new mattress, I was really trying not to drop a whole fat stack of cash on a new frame, too. I pulled up a few used furniture sites, but eventually landed on Craigslist as it had the most postings there. A lot of them were really cheap, or even free, but those ones all looked horrible. Then I came across one that didn't look too bad. It was just a plain old wooden bed frame that didn't look too beat up. I sent a quick email asking if it was still available, then went on with my search. About a minute later, I got a reply. The man said it was still available for $35. That was a perfect deal for me. I quickly accepted his offer, and we set up a time to meet later that day at 6. While I waited, I unboxed some of my things and moved a bunch of stuff around in the bedroom to make some space for that new frame. At 5:30, the man emailed me his address. It was about 20 minutes away in an area I hadn't been to yet. Well, I wasn't exactly familiar with anywhere around here too well, though. Since I'd just moved, I grabbed some cash and headed out. As I drove, I looked around frequently, trying to get myself familiar with what was around me. About halfway there, everything sort of dropped off, though. The town I was in very quickly ended, and the area became a lot less populated, with buildings or houses. It was not what I'd expected. As I got to the neighborhood this house was supposed to be in, though, I felt a little bit better. The houses weren't too far apart, and it did look mostly normal. However, they were definitely not nice-looking houses. I pulled up to the address and parked in the driveway. The lights were on, and the front door had been left open. I got out and walked up, ringing the doorbell. The man came a moment later. He was tall and heavy, wearing a hat and jacket. He invited me inside. The man didn't look strange in any way, but something about him made me feel weird. It was just the way he talked, I guess, kinda like we'd been buddies for years now. I followed him upstairs and down the hallway that led to a small bedroom. We stepped into the room and I was immediately confused. The room was occupied with a dresser, nightstand, and even clothes laying around. The bed frame still had a mattress on it, with sheets and blankets as well. I clarified with him that I was only wanting to buy the frame and not the mattress or anything else. He said, of course. I looked back over at the bed frame, seeing that it looked fine. I said I'd buy it, and he smiled. He offered to help me drag it out to my truck, but said he'd want a drink before we got to it. The man walked back into the hallway and came back immediately with 2 glasses of beer that he must have been keeping in the next room over. He held one out to me, but I politely declined. The man looked very confused. "Come on, it'll be fun." He acted like we might as well hang out since we were already here. I told him I was really busy that night and I just wanted to buy the bed frame and get out of there. He was being really pushy, though. His smile became noticeably less genuine as he urged me to have a sip of this drink with him. I quickly stepped past him and out into the hallway, not wanting to be cornered into that small room. I told him I was going to leave. I turned to walk out, and he immediately changed his attitude. He started being overly nice, apologizing and asking if I wanted to take the bed frame for free even. I ignored him and began walking faster down the stairs. I heard the man coming after me down the hallway. I was able to get out before he caught up to me, and I saw him standing at the front door as I pulled away. Maybe he was just some lonely guy living out there that wanted a buddy to hang out with, but that was all just a little too strange. I mean, the supposed bed frame and room it was in were clearly in use by someone. When I got home that night, I checked the posting again, but it was deleted. From my memory, though, I knew the bed frame was shown by itself with no mattress or anything on it. Now that I thought about it, that made it even stranger that it wasn't like that when I got there, considering his intent had been to sell it. But whatever that man was up to, I didn't like it, so I just got out of there. I was 9 years old when this happened. For whatever reason, I was home alone. Whenever I was left alone, it wasn't for long. My mom would just be out grocery shopping or something like that. I was playing Metroid Prime on my GameCube. I used to be obsessed with that game. Suddenly, I heard the house phone downstairs start to ring. My mom always told me to pick up the phone if it rang in case it was her calling, so I hurried downstairs, and by maybe the 4th ring I picked up. The caller ID was from my mom's cell phone. She said, "Sweetie, can you come outside and help with the groceries?" I replied, "Mom?" She said back, "Yes." I felt like something sounded off with her voice. You obviously know your own mom's voice, and so, even at such a young age, when I was questioning why it didn't sound like her, I said, "Why do you sound like that?" She replied, "Like what, sweetie?" And I hung up. My mom would never use the word sweetie like that, especially twice in a matter of seconds. The phone rang again, and my mom's number came up on the caller ID again. I ignored it. For some reason, my heart was racing. I was nervous. I sat in the kitchen waiting to see if the phone would ring a third time, and it did. It took a couple minutes before the third ringing, but when I checked the caller ID, this time it was a different number. I picked up, and a man's voice on the other end said, "Hey, James, I know this is going to sound weird, but it's your dad. I'm outside." All I could mutter out was a weak "What?" The man said, "I'm outside. I have a lot to explain." I hung up right then and there. My dad died when I was 3. I have no memories of him. My suspicion was in fact true that the first voice I heard was not my mom's. The phone rang again, and then again after that. I ignored it each time. I couldn't even call my mom because someone clearly had her phone. Then things took a turn for the worse when there were knocks at the front door. This went from a "someone has my mom's phone" situation to a "someone is outside the house" situation. My mom would not be knocking on the door. She'd have a key, obviously. I peered around the wall of the kitchen to look at the front door. I heard a man's muffled voice on the other side saying my name. He was saying, "It's your dad." He rang the doorbell, and then I heard him start attempting to open the door. I did something that no 9-year-old should ever have to do, and that was grabbing the phone and calling 911. The operator asked me what I imagined to be some pretty standard questions. Most importantly, telling me to wait in a bathroom or other room with a lockable door until the police get there. The bathroom is on the first floor of the house. I hid in there with the lights off. Whoever was outside came to the window and tried pulling it open. I heard their entire struggle. Then they must have moved to the next window. I think they tried every window and door in the house. If anything were to have been unlocked, this story would have had a very different outcome. They must have given up at some point before the police arrived. And I say they, because clearly there were 2 people involved in this, a man and a woman. They both could have been out there for all I know. The operator told me that the police are at the front door now and it's safe to go meet them there. Only when I opened the door to the police was when I hung up the phone. They did a quick investigation inside and outside of the house and asked me where my mom was supposed to be and if my mom knew anyone who might want to hurt us. I'm sure I said I thought she was grocery shopping or something, and not that I know of. My mom returned home with my little sister in a panic when she saw the police cars out front. My mom's phone was stolen, which was already clear. I'm sure that our address, home phone number, and other personal information was stored somewhere on the phone, easily accessible. Though how they knew my name, I'm not exactly sure. Something on my mom's phone must have given it away. It was an old Nokia flip phone. Who stole it was a mystery. But my mom's phone background was a picture of her with my little sister and I. This could have been an indication to some disgusting, creepy couple out there that the owner of this phone was a single mom with 2 young kids, and they tried to use that as a way of tricking me into leaving the house, which is absolutely disgusting and horrific. The phone must have been destroyed after the failed attempts of trying to lure me outside. Things were a little different after this. My mom wouldn't leave me alone anymore at night, not until I was a few years older at least. This happened last October when I was on my way home from a drinking night with my work colleagues. I caught the last train home and arrived at my station right as it came to about 1 a.m. It was Halloween, which was something I didn't particularly care about since we don't really do much for it here in Japan. I live in quite a rural area, so the station was empty, or so I thought. As I walked down towards the ticket gate, I saw a woman in a costume. She seemed a bit too old to be a trick-or-treater, I thought to myself. As I drew closer, I recognized that she was wearing some sort of witch costume. She looked as if she was waiting for someone. At the moment I passed her by, she abruptly called out to me, though. "Hey, where do you live?" I continued walking. It was so surreal. I just looked back over my shoulder. She was stood there, staring at me. She had long, dark, messy hair, and I remember at the time that only one of her eyes were visible through it. That kind of freaked me out. It was a bit dark in this underground station, and it was an eerie sight to see her standing there. I didn't know how else to explain it. There's no reason to get involved. Don't respond, I told myself as I upped my pace and headed out the exit. It takes about 15 minutes to get home from the station on foot. At that time of night, in my rural area, I knew there would be practically no one out in the streets. It did make me feel a little nervous while I was walking home. I could hear dogs howling in the distance, and my footsteps seemed to echo behind me. It was all adding to this eerie ambiance. I kept looking over my shoulder. When I turned around a corner to see someone stood underneath a streetlight, the silhouette of a woman, I wanted to pass by quickly. Something was really off about tonight, the first time I'd ever felt this way on Halloween. "Where do you live?" a familiar voice asked. Shivers raced up and down my spine. It was that same woman in the Halloween costume from the station. I looked back, and she took a step toward me. I started bolting. I ran, checking over my shoulder. I ran out of breath eventually, and got a real stitch, too. Goddamn beers. I had to stop in a dark alleyway to take a break. I looked back behind me, and I couldn't find that woman anywhere. I walked down the alley, feeling a bit relieved. "Where do you live?" My heart froze. What the hell was happening? I was shaking. This time I didn't see her at all. I didn't even hear her coming. It sounded as if she was directly above me or something. I spun around in every direction. I was really panicking now. I shut my eyes for a second, and when I opened them, I saw her emerging from behind something, slowly walking toward me. "Where do you live? Why is this happening to me?" My legs were trembling. Even though I was still drunk, I'd never felt fear like that before or since. I didn't know what to do. This lady wouldn't leave me alone, and if I walked all the way home, she would surely find a way to follow me. I pointed to a random house across the street from the alley and blurted out that I lived there. The woman in the costume turned her head slowly toward the house I was pointing at. She then gave a big smile and looked back at me one last time, then back toward the house. With that strange woman now distracted, I took my opportunity to run for it again. I looked over my shoulder to see if she was still following me, but she was just stood still, staring at the house I'd pointed at. She was so creepy. Was this some kind of Halloween prank? I had no idea, but I didn't want to find out. I got home and triple-checked all the doors and windows were locked. I stayed up half the night, watching out the window to see if the woman was out there somewhere. I didn't see her, though. Time went by, but I couldn't forget about that strange experience. I can't really remember her face that well, and my memory is a little bit hazy from being drunk. I still get shivers every now and then when I think about that night. A few weeks after the incident, on a Sunday, I was taking a walk with my daughter in the neighborhood. I noticed a moving truck, and the truck was parked right outside the house I'd pointed at that night. I remembered that woman's voice, asking me where I lived. I shuddered. I thought to myself at the time, surely it's a coincidence. The people who lived there were just moving out for something else. But honestly, I wondered if maybe she did something to them that made them want to move out. The owners of the house came out holding boxes and looked exhausted and miserable. Something must have happened there. I could still hear that woman's voice ringing in my head. "Where do you live?" I grabbed my child's hand and started to walk away as fast as I could.